and gradually her head and shoulders sank back, and hung loosely over the chair. Nella was conscious of a sudden revulsion. The woman had surely fainted. Dropping the revolver, she ran round the table. She was herself again, feminine, sympathetic, the old Nella. She felt immensely relieved that this had happened. But at the same instant Miss Spencer sprang up from the chair like a cat, seized the revolver, and with a wild movement of the arm flung it against the window. It crashed through the glass, exploding as it went, and there was a tense silence. "I told you that you were a fool," remarked Miss Spencer slowly. "Coming here like a sort of female Jack Sheppard, and trying to get the best of me. We are on equal terms now. You frightened me, but I knew I was a cleverer woman than you, and that in the end, if I kept on long enough, I should win. Now it will be my turn." Dumbfounded, and overcome with a miserable sense of the truth of Miss Spencer's words, Nella stood still. The idea of her colossal foolishness swept through her like a flood. She felt almost ashamed, but even at this juncture she had no fear. She faced the woman bravely, her mind leaping about in search of some plan. She could think of nothing but a bribe, an enormous bribe. "I admit you've won," she said, "but I've not finished yet. Just listen." Miss Spencer folded her arms and glanced at the door, smiling bitterly. "You know my father is a millionaire. Perhaps you know that he is one of the richest men in the world. If I give you my word of honour not to reveal anything that you've told me, what will you take to let me go free?" "What sum do you suggest?" asked Miss Spencer carelessly. £20,000, said Nella promptly. She had begun to regard the affair as a business operation. Miss Spencer's lip curled. 100,000. Again Miss Spencer's lip curled. "Well, say 1,000,000. I can rely on my father, and so may you." "You think you are worth 1,000,000 to him?" "I do," said Nella. "And do you think we could trust you to see that it was paid?" "Of course you could." "And we should not suffer afterwards in any way?" "I would give you my word, and my father's word." "Bah!" exclaimed Miss Spencer. "How do you know I wouldn't let you go free for nothing? You're only a rash, silly girl." "I know you wouldn't. I can read your face too well." "You're right," Miss Spencer replied slowly. "I wouldn't. I wouldn't let you go for all the dollars in America." Nella felt cold down the spine, and sat down again in her chair. A draught of air from the broken window blew on her cheek. Steps sounded in the passage. The door opened, but Nella did not turn round. She could not move her eyes from Miss Spencer's. There was a noise of rushing water in her ears. She lost consciousness, and slipped limply to the ground. Chapter 10. At Sea. It seemed to Nella that she was being rocked gently in a vast cradle, which swayed to and fro with a motion at once slow and incredibly gentle. This sensation continued for some time, and there was added to it the sound of a quick, quiet, muffled beat. Soft, exhilarating breezes wafted her forward in spite of herself, and yet she remained in a delicious calm. She wondered if her mother was kneeling by her side, whispering some lullaby in her childish ears. Then strange colours swam before her eyes, her eyelids quavered, and at last she awoke. For a few moments her gaze travelled to and fro in a vain search for some clue to her surroundings. She was aware of nothing except a sense of repose and a feeling of relief that some mighty and fatal struggle was over. She cared not whether she had conquered or suffered defeat in the struggle of her soul with some other soul. It was finished, done with, and the consciousness of its conclusion satisfied and contented her. Gradually her brain, recovering from its obsession, began to grasp the phenomena of her surroundings, and she saw that she was on a yacht, and that the yacht was moving. The motion of the cradle was the smooth rolling of the vessel, the beat was the beat of its screw. The strange colours were the cloud tints thrown by the sun as it rose over a distant and receding shore in the wake of the yacht. Her mother's lullaby was the crooned song of the man at the wheel. Nella all through her life had had many experiences of yachting. From the waters of the river Hudson to those bluer tides of the Mediterranean Sea, she had yachted in all seasons and all weathers. She loved the water, and now it seemed deliciously right and proper that she should be on the water again. She raised her head to look round, and then let it sink back. She was fatigued, enervated. She desired only solitude and calm. She had no care, no anxiety, no responsibility. 100 years might have passed since her meeting with Miss Spencer, and the memory of that meeting appeared to have faded into the remotest background of her mind. It was a small yacht, and her practised eye at once told that it belonged to the highest aristocracy of pleasure craft. As she reclined in the deck chair (it did not occur to her at that moment to speculate as to the identity of the person who had led her therein), she examined all visible details of the vessel. The deck was as white and smooth as her own hand, and the seams ran along its length like blue veins. All the brass work, from the band round the slender funnel to the concave surface of the binnacle, shone like gold. The tapered masts stretched upwards at a rakish angle, and the rigging seemed like spun silk. No sails were set. The yacht was under steam, and doing about 7 or 8 knots. She judged that it was a boat of 100 tons or so, probably Clyde built, and not more than 2 or 3 years old. No one was to be seen on deck except the man at the wheel. This man wore a blue jersey, but there was neither name nor initial on the jersey, nor was there a name on the white lifebuoys lashed to the main rigging, nor on the polished dinghy which hung on the starboard davits. She called to the man, and called again, in a feeble voice, but the steerer took no notice of her, and continued his quiet song as though nothing else existed in the universe save the yacht, the sea, the sun, and himself. Then her eyes swept the outline of the land from which they were hastening, and she could just distinguish a lighthouse and a great white irregular dome, which she recognized as the Kursaal at Ostend, that gorgeous rival of the gaming palace at Monte Carlo. So she was leaving Ostend. The rays of the sun fell on her caressingly, like a restorative. All around the water was changing from wonderful greys and dark blues to still more wonderful pinks and translucent unearthly greens. The magic kaleidoscope of dawn was going forward in its accustomed way, regardless of the vicissitudes of mortals. Here and there in the distance she descried a sail, the brown sail of some Ostend fishing boat returning home after a night's trawling. Then the beat of paddles caught her ear, and a steamer blundered past, wallowing clumsily among the waves like a tortoise. It was the Swallow from London. She could see some of its passengers leaning curiously over the aft rail. A girl in a mackintosh signalled to her, and mechanically she answered the salute with her arm. The officer of the bridge of the Swallow hailed the yacht, but the man at the wheel offered no reply. In another minute the Swallow was nothing but a blot in the distance. Nella tried to sit straight in the deck chair, but she found herself unable to do so. Throwing off the rug which covered her, she discovered that she had been tied to the chair by means of a piece of broad webbing. Instantly she was alert, awake, angry. She knew that her perils were not over. She felt that possibly they had scarcely yet begun. Her lazy contentment, her dreamy sense of peace and repose, vanished utterly, and she steeled herself to meet the dangers of a grave and difficult situation. Just at that moment a man came up from below. He was a man of 40 or so, clad in irreproachable blue, with a peaked yachting cap. He raised the cap politely. "Good morning," he said. "Beautiful sunrise, isn't it?" The clever and calculated insolence of his tone cut her like a lash as she lay bound in the chair. Like all people who have lived easy and joyous lives in those fair regions where gold smooths every crease and law keeps a tight hand on disorder, she found it hard to realize that there were other regions where gold was useless and law without power. 24 hours ago she would have declared it impossible that such an experience as she had suffered could happen to anyone. She would have talked airily about civilization and the 19th century, and progress and the police, but her experience was teaching her that human nature remains always the same, and that beneath the thin crust of security on which we good citizens exist, the dark and secret forces of crime continue to move, just as they did in the days when you couldn't go from Cheapside to Chelsea without being set upon by thieves. Her experience was in a fair way to teach her this lesson better than she could have learned it even in the bureau of the detective police of Paris, London, and St. Petersburg. "Good morning," the man repeated, and she glanced at him with a sullen, angry gaze. "You!" she exclaimed. "You, Mr. Thomas Jackson, if that is your name. Loose me from this chair, and I will talk to you." Her eyes flashed as she spoke, and the contempt in them added mightily to her beauty. Mr. Thomas Jackson, otherwise Jules, erstwhile head waiter at the Grand Babylon, considered himself a connoisseur in feminine loveliness, and the vision of Nella Racksole smote him like an exquisite blow. "With pleasure," he replied. "I had forgotten that to prevent you from falling I had secured you to the chair." And with a quick movement he unfastened the band. Nella stood up, quivering with fiery annoyance and scorn. "Now," she said, fronting him, "what is the meaning of this?